Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. In this video, we're going to take a look into Jack the Ripper. I'm not an expert, not by any means a ripperologist. Like a lot of people, the only information I knew about Jack the Ripper is that we don't know his identification. He's unknown. So let's try to find out who is Jack the Ripper, what's the story behind this figure. Are you fascinated by this killer? Do you think we will ever know his identity? But first, let's start from the beginning. Jack the Ripper was an unidentified serial killer. He was also known as the Whitechapel murderer and Leather Apron. His crimes happened in the Whitechapel district, in a part of London where there was a very high crime rate. It was also a place where domestic violence was common practice. Even though there were some murders in the area from 1888 to 1891 targeting prostitutes, only 5 murders from August 1888 to November 1888 were actually connected to Jack the Ripper. There were a series of attacks involving prostitutes who lived and worked in the slums of the East End of London. I want to point out that prostitutes are probably one of the most vulnerable groups and easy targets to criminals because of their lifestyle. It is actually expected to occur some violence, some attacks, which could also result to death. There's another serial killer who was famous, who targeted prostitutes. He was the Long Island serial killer. Different times, same results. No arrests. In mid-19th century, Britain had a big influx of Irish immigrants. And from 1882, there was also a mass immigration of Jews and other minorities who were being persecuted by the Tsarist Empire. This mass immigration overcrowded the area, and because of this, parts of the East End were lawless ghettos. People lived in poor conditions. They were surrounded by prostitution, poverty, vice, villainy, crime, and drunkenness. For many of these people, the only way to make a living was actually by criminal means. And for women, of course, it meant prostitution. Many of these people lived in common lodging houses where they paid per bed or a lean-to rope stretched across the bedroom. These lodging houses, they had to be licensed. They were subject to strict police supervision. It had to display a number of beds to which it was licensed. Bed linen had to be changed weekly. The windows had to be opened daily at 10 a.m. for ventilation. Men and women dormitories had to be separate. They had one common kitchen. Each person was actually responsible for their own food. The lodging houses were owned by middle-class entrepreneurs and investors who lived outside the area, and most of them would take profit from illegal activities. When it comes to prostitution at the time was only illegal if it caused public disturbance. Prostitutes were subject to violent physical attacks, which some resulted in death, but these deaths rarely were reported in the news. However, there was a series of murders involving prostitutes that stood out because of the nature of its crimes. They also didn't know how many victims were connected to the same killer. The Whitechapel murders consist of 11 murders, and within those 11, 5 of them were considered linked to Jack the Ripper, and they were called the Canonical Five. Some of the 11 victims were killed before and after the Canonical Five. So, in chronological order, let's see who they were. April 1888. Emma Elizabeth Smith. She was robbed and assaulted. She was bludgeoned to the face and had a cut into her ear. She had a blunt object inserted into her vagina, and she testified that she was attacked by 2 or 3 men, including a teenager, and she then developed peritonitis and died. Her case was actually linked to gang violence and not Jack the Ripper. August 1888, Martha Tabram. She was found murdered on a staircase. She suffered 39 stabs to her throat, lungs, heart, lower spleen, stomach, abdomen, breasts, and vagina. The wounds were inflicted by a right-handed individual. She wasn't assaulted, and she wasn't connected to the Ripper case because the pattern of the wounds, they were different, but I disagree. I think that she might have been one of his victims. What do you think? August 31st, 1888, Mary Ann Nichols. She was found with her face bruised. Her throat was cut, her vagina was stabbed twice, and her lower part of the abdomen was partly ripped open. September 8th, 1888, Annie Chapman. Her throat was severed by 2 cuts. Her abdomen had been cut open. A section of her flesh from her stomach was placed on her left shoulder, and another section of skin and flesh, the intestines, were actually placed on her right shoulder. And her uterus, section of her bladder, and vagina had been removed. September 30th, 1888, Elizabeth Stride. She only had a single clear-cut incision across her neck. Just that. And because there wasn't any other mutilations to her body, some people question if she was a Jack the Ripper victim or the attack was interrupted. Maybe she just wasn't a victim of Jack the Ripper at all. Not everybody has to be a victim of Jack the Ripper. On the same day, September 30th, 1888, Catherine Eddowes. Her throat was severed, her abdomen was ripped open, her intestines were placed over her right shoulder, her left kidney and major part of her uterus had been removed, and her nose was severed. Her cheeks were slashed, and she had cuts vertically incised through her eyelids. There was also a triangular incision carved on her cheeks. They also found a piece of her apron, and on the wall, in chalk, you could read, "The Jews are the men that will be blamed for nothing." The police cleaned it to prevent a public uproar. November 9th, 1888, Mary Jane Kelly. Her face was disfigured beyond recognition. Her throat was severed down the spine. Her abdomen had almost all of its organs removed. Her uterus, kidneys, and one breast had been placed beneath her head, and the other insides from her body were placed beside her foot, about the bed. A section of her abdomen and thigh were placed upon a bedside table, and also the heart was missing. December 20th, 1888, Rose Milet. She was found strangled. Some people thought it was accidental or that she committed suicide. However, they found markings left by a cord on one side of her neck, and this suggested that she was strangled. But I don't think she was a victim of Jack the Ripper. July 17th, 1888, Alice Mackenzie. She had 2 stab wounds to her neck. Her left carotid artery had been severed. She had minor bruises and cuts on her body, and she had a 7-inch long superficial wound beneath her left breast and her navel. She doesn't seem like a Ripper victim. September 1889, the Pinchin Street torso. Torso belonged to an unidentified woman aged between 30 and 40 with a headless and legless torso in decomposition. There were bruises on the victim's back, hip, and arm, which indicated she was beaten before death. The abdomen was mutilated and the genitals were intact. I don't think this was a Ripper victim. I think that they cut her head so people wouldn't know who she was. Maybe this was also a revenge. This was the wife of someone, and they cut her legs to give them a warning, you can't run. February 1891, Frances Coles. Her throat was deeply cut and her body wasn't mutilated. There were other alleged victims. However, these were the Whitechapel murders, and only 5 of these were linked to Jack the Ripper. Regarding the Canonical Five, some researchers believe that some murders were indeed the work of one single killer. Others say that only 3 were connected to Jack the Ripper, and those were Nichols, Chapman, and Eddowes. Other people believe that 6 cases were actually linked to Jack the Ripper, and some believe 3 of them were the work of Jack the Ripper, but the others were from people who wanted to emulate or imitate Jack the Ripper. What do you think? Jack the Ripper's victims victims had similar wound patterns, and those were the genital area, the face, the neck, and the abdomen area was ripped open with almost all of its insides taken out and displayed. Even though victims who showed these wound patterns were considered the work of Jack the Ripper, it's not uncommon for killers to change their MO. Usually when the killer kills, they grow with the attacks. They perfect their techniques. So the Ripper may have started with just assaulting women and then it escalated into killings. Is this the case of Jack the Ripper? Well, back in the day, in 1888, investigation techniques weren't like today because they didn't exist. However, they did use something that they still use today, photography. They photographed Mary Jane Kelly at the scene, and they thought that if they photographed the victim's eyes, they would see preserved on her retina the face of her killer. Unfortunately, other crime scenes weren't photographed, especially those who were found outside. They also didn't use fingerprinting, even though it already existed, but it wasn't police protocol at the time. The police interviewed more than 2,000 people, they investigated 300 and detained 80. Suspects ranged from butchers, slaughterers, surgeons, and physicians because of the manner of the mutilation. All of them were investigated and cleared. Over 100 people were considered suspects, and people thought that the killer was educated, he was upper class, he was a doctor, an aristocrat. Many famous names were considered suspects, even a member of the British royal family, an artist, and a physician. Of the many suspects, some stood out, such Leather Apron, who was then identified and arrested. His real name was John Pizer, and he was discarded as Jack the Ripper. Then there's William Henry Bury. He was convicted and hanged for the murder of his wife. He confessed to strangling his wife and for trying to dismember her body, but he couldn't continue because it was too squeamish. So I don't think he would be able to mutilate the women like Jack the Ripper did. Then we have Montague John Druitt. He was a son of a medical practitioner. He became a suspect because they thought the Ripper would have the skills of a physician or a butcher. He committed suicide, and the timing of this was the reason why he became a suspect, but there was no evidence connecting him to Whitechapel. Then comes James Maybrick, and he's very interesting. He was a suspect of poisoning his wife with arsenic. In 1992, there was a diary taking credit of the Canonical Five. There is no name mentioned, but it was believed that it was Maybrick's diary. In 1993, a gentleman's pocket watch was discovered having J. Maybrick scratched on the cover alongside the initials of the 5 victims, and it was written, "I am Jack." Investigations and testings regarding these items were inconclusive. Some people thought that his wife found out he was the Ripper and she decided to kill him. These were all rumors, there's no evidence. Then we have Walter Richard Sickert. He was a painter who took inspiration from Jack the Ripper. An author named Stephen Knight claimed that Walter was an accomplice because the information given by Walter's illegitimate son. In 2002, author Patricia Cornwell stated that she believed Walter was the killer. She bought several paintings from the artist and tried to retrieve DNA evidence. She claimed that she was able to prove mitochondrial DNA connected to a Ripper letter. There's no evidence suggesting Walter was Jack, and general consensus say that the letters didn't belong to Jack the Ripper, which means that, if anything, Walter Sickert was actually the author of a Noakes letter. Then we have Francis Tumblety. He was a suspect of being Jack the Ripper. He was arrested on November 1888 on unrelated charges. He was released on bail and he fled to the US. When they asked for his extradition, the New York City police said that there was no proof he was the Whitechapel murder, so he wasn't extradited. Then comes Aaron Kaminsky. He was a Polish established Jewish hairdresser. He was considered a suspect since the beginning of the investigation. In February 1891, he was certified insane and taken into an asylum. There was no evidence connecting Kaminsky to Jack the Ripper. And finally, Joseph Barnett. He's my favorite. He lived with Mary Jane Kelly, the last victim. There were rumors that he was in love with her. He didn't like her prostituting to other men. He supported her for a while, but he lost his job and then she went back to prostitution. It was also rumored that he tried to scare her away through the other murders, but she wasn't scared. They both had an argument. Barnett moved out, and 10 days later, she was found brutally murdered. It was the most brutal of all the victims. It was the only case committed inside. His physical description and appearance fits into a number of eyewitnesses, and he also fits into the FBI profile and physical description, but there was no evidence. When they say evidence, I think it means biological evidence, like DNA. And remember that Mary Jane Kelly was the victim who was photographed to see if they could catch the killer's face on her retina. Remember that one? But this could also be a coincidence, and he imitated Jack the Ripper, so he could get away with it. With the gruesome murders becoming more violent, the community became more agitated, and the fact that the police hadn't made it an arrest, there was a lot of criticism and unhappy people. Some people were concerned that the murders were affecting businesses in the area. So, in September 1888, a group of volunteer citizens formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, and they patrolled the streets looking for a suspicious character. During the murders and investigation, they received hundreds of letters regarding the case. Some letters were advice on how to catch the killer, other letters were just hoaxes, and some of them were claimed to be written by Jack the Ripper, and some of them stood out, like the Dear Boss letter, September 25th, 1888. It was considered an hoax. However, Catherine Eddowes was found a few days later. Catherine had a section of her hair cut from her body, and the author of the letter stated in that letter to clip the lady's hairs off, and this gained a lot of attention. The other letters followed the same tone. The next letter was The Saucy Jackie. It was postmarked October 1888. The handwriting was similar to the Dear Boss. It mentions the Canonical Five double event, and this means the Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes murders on the same day. However, it was postmarked 24 hours after the killings. And finally, the letter from hell, October 16, 1888. The handwriting and style was different from the Dear Boss letter and Saucy Jackie. But here's the thing, the letter came with a small box, and it contained half human kidney preserved in ethanol. The author of the letter said that he fried and he ate the missing half of the kidney. Some people said that the kidney belonged to Catherine Eddowes, and other people said that it was just a bad joke. What do you think? Do you think any of these letters belong to Jack the Ripper? After the murder of Francis Coles, the Whitechapel murders came to an end. Some people believe the killings ended because the killer might have been arrested on unrelated charges. He might have died, or he might have been committed into an asylum. Can we just add that he just stopped? Or maybe he stopped because he killed the object of his hatred. And who is that person? Is it Mary Jane Kelly? Is it Mr. Joseph Barnett? On October 1888, a surgeon named Thomas Bond gave his opinion on the offender. His opinion was based on his examination of the most mutilated victim, and of course the post-mortem notes from the other canonical victims. According to him, the crimes were committed by the same hand. The women must have been lying down when they were murdered. In every case, the first cut was always the throat. He disagrees with the idea that the murderer had scientific or anatomical knowledge, or technical knowledge of a butcher or a slaughterer. He also said that the killer had a solitary habit, and he had periodical attacks acts of homicidal and erotic mania. 100 years later, in 1988, FBI Special Agent John E. Douglas did a profile on Jack the Ripper. John Douglas was one of the first criminal profilers, and he created and managed the FBI's criminal profiling program. He interviewed serial killers and other violent sex offenders like Ted Bundy, Ed Kemper, Charles Manson. He has written several books on criminal psychology, and one of them was Mindhunter, which was inspiration for a TV series. John Douglas was provided background information to each case, and I'm going to look into his assessment on the killer's traits and characteristics, and let's see if any of the subjects mentioned before fit into the description. So get your detective groove on, and remember this is between us. It's a secret. So, according to John Douglas, the crimes are referred as lust murders, and it doesn't mean love or sex. It's because the killer attacked the genital areas of the victim, and this means the breasts and the vagina. The killer was male, he was white, because white was the predominant race at the crime scene locations, and these types of crimes are usually intraracial. For these types of murders, the age is usually between mid to late 20s. The ability to talk to the victim until a location that was suitable and the ability to avoid detection puts Jack the Ripper between the age of 28 to 36. The killer doesn't look out of the ordinary. The clothing that he wears at the time of the assaults weren't his daily clothing. He intended to project himself as someone who had money, and this would make the prostitutes to initiate contact. He was raised by a domineering mother. He had a weak, passive, or absent father. It's likely that his mother drank heavily, and she enjoyed the company of men. He didn't receive consistent care or contact with stable adults. He was socially detached. He had diminished emotional response towards other people. He was asocial and preferred to be alone. As a small child, he acted his destructive emotions by setting fires and torturing small animals. By these acts, he discovered areas of dominance, power, and control, and learned to continue violent destructive acts without detection or punishment. As he grew older, his fantasies developed into domination, cruelty, and mutilation of women. You would probably find evidence of his fantasies through personal writing or drawings of women being mutilated. As for a job occupation, he would seek a position where he could work alone and experience his destructive fantasies. And this includes jobs such as butcher, mortician's helper, medical examiner's assistant, or a hospital attendant. He was employed from Monday through Friday. He had a knife for defensive purposes, and his paranoid thinking was because of his poor self-image. He would have some physical abnormalities, not severe, but psychologically crippling. He would be below or above average in height and or weight. He may have had problems with speech. He probably had scarred complexion or a physical illness or injury. He wasn't expected to be married, and if he was, it would have been with an older woman, and it would have been a short-lived marriage. He didn't like meeting people. His heterosexual relationships would have been with prostitutes. And here, because of the lack of hygiene by prostitutes at the time and the absence of treatment for venereal diseases, he might have been infected, and of course this would increase his hatred and disgust for women. At work, he would have been quiet, a loner, shy, slightly withdrawn, obedient, neat and orderly. He drank in the local pubs. He lived or worked in the Whitechapel area. The first homicide should have been close to his home or workplace. He was probably interviewed during investigation, and he probably talked to the police on several occasions. And because people had this preconceived idea that the killer was this huge monster with a ghoulish appearance, the killer was probably overlooked and or eliminated as a suspect. Prior to each homicide, he would have been into a local pub drinking spirits to help him lower his inhibitions. He would have walked all over the Whitechapel area during the early evening hours. He didn't look for specific looking women. It wasn't accidental that he killed prostitutes, and he knew where and when to attack. Other women would have confronted him, but he didn't attack them because of the location. After the killings, he would return to an area where he would wash his hands and blood and remove his clothing. He wasn't expected to insert himself into the investigation or give false testimony. He hunted at night for his victims, and when he couldn't find one, he would have returned to the location where he had killed before. If the victims were buried locally, he would have visited the grave sites during early morning to relive his lost murders. And finally, he wouldn't have committed suicide. Generally, crimes like this stop because he came close to being caught. He was interviewed by the police or arrested on some other charges. Some forensic scientists using genetics testing point to a possible identification of Jack the Ripper. And let's start. Aaron Kaminsky. He was a 23-year-old published barber, and he was a prime suspect at the time. However, critics say that the evidence isn't strong. So, these testings were conducted on a stained shawl, which investigators said they found next to the mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes. The shawl was speckled with blood and semen from the killer, and the analysis suggested the killer had brown eyes and brown hair. Some critics pointed that there's no evidence the shawl was even at the crime scene, and they also pointed that the shawl could have been contaminated. And here comes another one. Crime author Patricia Cornwell asked some scientists to analyze DNA in samples from letters written by the killer. Based on the analysis and other clues, she said that the killer was the painter Walter Sickert. Many experts believe that the letters were actually fake, and after genetic analysis, they also claim that the murder could have been a woman. Jack the Ripper has grown worldwide fascination, and his unknown identity has captivated the attention of many. There are a lot of theories and conspiracies. There are also websites dedicated to the killer, exploring every single information about these crimes in the hopes of finding the true identity of the history's most famous serial killer. He's not the first, but the first most famous. While my knowledge of Jack the Ripper has always been, we don't know who he is. And I think that's what fascinates people. It's the puzzle people want to solve. But here's my question. Do you think people really want to know the true identity of the Ripper? If they do, don't you think all the fascination would disappear? I really don't think it's possible to find out who is Jack the Ripper. I don't think they will find his true identity. And this was also because of the poor job the police at the time did. I think because of the impact of the murders, the police at the time was overwhelmed and they didn't know how to handle it. And regarding those genetic tests, some evidence alleged that the killer could have been a woman. I honestly don't believe it. Usually these crimes are committed by men. So, John Douglas, the FBI agent, he said that the killer would have kept a diary or drawings of mutilated women, and we have two suspects who fit into this. James Maybrick and his diary, although it was said that it was forged, and Walter Sickert and his paintings. He also stated that the Ripper had a domineering mother who drank heavily, who liked to spend time with men. And I kind of agree with this. So when he was killing those prostitutes, it was like he was killing his mother over and over again. And here's the thing, sometimes serial killers stop killing because they killed their object of their rage. And in this case, his mother. Do you think the Ripper might have killed his mother? And what about Joseph Barnett? He's my favorite. The one who was Mary Jane Kelly's companion. Although they didn't find any evidence, he had motive, and it seems quite compelling, doesn't it? And what do you think about the FBI's profile analysis? What do you think about that? So this is the story of Jack the Ripper, a short version. Jack the Ripper, Master of the Unknown. And to end this, don't forget to subscribe, click the notification bell button, press that like button. Thank you for watching, see you the next time, and don't forget, stay safe.